All right. Welcome to another episode of KUDEN Radio. So, have you ever noticed that some of the most important lessons they don't seem connected at first? If you can remember that far back when you first started training. Um, a few weeks ago, a few episodes ago, we talked about why copying the master doesn't make you a master, right? And then we looked at why the attack won't always come from where you're necessarily looking, right? More recently, we explored Hapo, right? These 8 directions, those kind of things, right? But not just as 8 directions around your body that you can move from, right? But as attack vectors, right? Where the attack could come in from, even as a way of expanding your perception so you don't become trapped by a single viewpoint, like just one way of looking at things, right? And on the surface, those all seem like completely different topics, right? One's about learning, one's about awareness, one's about strategy. But over the last several weeks, again, over the last several episodes, depending on how you're following along, you may have noticed that they've all been pointing toward pretty much the same hidden problem, right? And it's a problem that affects, I think, every martial artist, right? Every instructor, every leader, every parent, right? And if we're honest, right, we're talking about life, every one of us, right? It begins, excuse me, I'll tell you about my voice here in a bit. It begins with a phrase we probably say every day. The phrase is, I know, or I know that, right? And it sounds harmless, right? And sometimes it's even true. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, what do you actually mean when you say, I know? Or when you say, I know that thing, that person, whatever, right? If I were to ask, do you know Abraham Lincoln? Um, my foreign friends notwithstanding, but maybe, right? But if I were to ask, do you know Abraham Lincoln, right? Most people would laugh, right? And they not, right? But if I asked, do you know Hatsumi Sensei? Or do you know Omotogyaku? Or even, do you know your spouse? See, now the answers suddenly become much less obvious, much less cut and dry, right? So, what does it actually mean to know someone, to know a technique, to know a principle, right? Does seeing it once or a couple of times mean that you know it? Does performing it correctly mean you know it? Does teaching it mean you know it, right? And if so, to what degree, right? Or is there another level entirely, another one beyond wherever I happen to be? Okay. So what's this all pointing to? Well, it's pointing to the fact that I think one of the greatest dangers in martial arts isn't ignorance. It's not knowing, right? Ignorance is easy to recognize, right? I think the greatest danger is familiarity, because familiarity has a way of subtly convincing us that there's nothing left to study, nothing more to look at, nothing more, right? And while we might hear a teacher or somebody make a statement like that, and while ego may jump into its oppositional, defiant, or contrarian persona and say, no, I don't actually believe that. actions might say something different, right? Because if that's the case, what ends up happening is we stop asking questions. We stop asking better questions. We stop looking more deeply than what we already know, what we already think we have a handle on, right? What we've already classified, categorized, whatever, right? Not because we don't care, right? It's not that, right? It's because our minds naturally begin filling in the blanks with assumptions. And those assumptions become invisible, right? And the strange part is the longer you've trained, the easier it is for that to happen. I know. I've been there. I bought the t-shirt, right? Sold it, burned it, whatever, right? But the longer you've trained, the easier it is for that to happen. Okay. So today, during this episode, I want to explore the almost hidden difference, the not so obvious difference between recognizing something, knowing something, and truly understanding that thing. Right? Because I believe that the difference explains why some people continue growing class after class, week after week, month after month, for decades, right? While others, often unknowingly, right, begin just repeating the same level of training year after year, right? Just with different techniques, different kata, different henko, right? So let me ask you one question before we officially start the episode. What are you assuming that you've stopped looking at, that you've stopped investigating, right? So we'll talk about that and more after we get started.
So, the big question is this: how are self-defense and success-minded people like us, concerned citizens worried about protecting ourselves, our loved ones, and the things we care about from the monsters we know exist in the world? How do we train in a way that gives us the skills, knowledge, and understanding we need without becoming paranoid fighters or killers ourselves, and yet still allows us to be the hero protector the world needs us to be? That's the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Jeffrey Miller, and welcome to KUDEN Radio. Real training for real people in a real world.
All right, we are back. John Miller here from Warrior Concepts. Of course, you know that. Anyway, here's me again, for those of you who are regulars, sounding, I don't know, maybe like I'm 85 now. I was way worse earlier. Asthma and whatever crap is in the air and seasons and whatever. So anyway, I'm not dying. Hopefully my voice holds out for the episode. But anyway, we're here again. This is episode 317. I'm here. Sensei Alexander's here. James, are you there? Hiding in the background. Ta-da! Nope, he didn't pop up yet. Ta-da! See, there he is. Anyway, how are you? How was your weekend? You went camping.
Good. I did.
You went on a family outing.
Yep.
How did you?
Kind of.
Did you recovered okay? It went well.
It went well. It was good.
Didn't kill anybody. Nobody fell into the fire pit. Nobody.
Well, we get our own campsite, so I can.
Oh, well, there you go.
You know.
Did you put up like concertina wire around the thing to keep them from coming in? All right. You want anything? Just yell. Just don't wander over here. Yeah. All right. We're both scratching and stuff. I need a shave, I need a haircut. Look at that, man. I'm overgrown. Anyway, voice is crap. Anyway, so who do we have on? Who's on?
So far we got Alan, Kyle, and Maury, and Kyle said one of my favorite quotes from Einstein is, "Any fool can know. The point is to understand."
What did Einstein know anyway? Anyway, all right. So cool. All right. So so we're starting off with our regular motley crew. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay. Well, good. Now you and I've had a chance to chat. Kyle's had a chance to like initiate conversation instead of waiting until Alan does something or says something or whatever. So let me go ahead and yeah. Is that what he said, or is that what you said?
Nice.
It's scooch around a little bit,
Yeah.
move the big gulp over, and yeah. Anyway, all right. That being said, let me jump into things. All right. After all that, and as usual, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of KUDEN, where we explore the deeper lessons hidden within the martial traditions, right? Not simply to become better martial artists, right? But to become better warrior protectors in every area of our lives. And if that's not your goal, it's okay. You can still stay on. We can still be friends. Just know that we're not just sticking to step-by-step discussion of things. That's not what KUDEN even means, right? In the whole context of training. Remember, we have Taiden, KUDEN, and Shinden, right? 3 aspects of training. When I was coming up through the ranks, our testing for different levels involved all of those, okay? Not just physical performance or techniques, right? But also KUDEN, understanding, right? Knowledge, where we're retaining things, and Shinden, right? How is our life changing, improving, right? How is our ability to produce better results with less effort also improving? Okay. So, as always, if you're joining me live, let me know where you're watching from, or that kind of thing. And if you're catching this later during a replay on YouTube or one of the other platforms, or you're on one of the podcast directories, Spotify, Pandora, Apple Podcast, whatever, right? You can always shoot us an email over at warriorc@warrior-concepts-online.com. Give us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you have any suggestions or requests for topics, because I think what's going to be coming up here probably around episode 320, because I already have next one and the one after planned out, is it might be fun to do a Q&A, right? Like your questions, my answers kind of thing. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. All right. Anyway, so as always, right, I enjoyed seeing just how far this little community reaches every Monday when we go live. So if you're watching the replay, I'd still love to hear from you, right? Either way, jump down to the comments. Let me know what resonates with you, what has resonated with you from maybe prior things, or what makes KUDEN stand out for you. What does it make? Why do you keep coming back, so to speak, right? Or if there's a moment during this episode where something you've known for years, quote unquote, known for years, right, suddenly ends up looking different, let me know that too, okay? Because I have a feeling that that's going to happen, right, during this episode. So before we dive in, if you find these conversations valuable, please take just a moment to click the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, share this episode with someone else who's serious about growing, not just in martial arts, but in life, right? I have lots of people that reach out from other sectors and whatnot. They're in business, they're in education or whatever. And they've been applying these things to their leadership roles or their classrooms, or using them on their kids. Either way, right? Just making some shifts, making some changes. All right. So either way, right? Sharing, liking, all those kind of things. Those simple actions help these conversations reach people who are looking for something deeper than just another collection of techniques. Okay. All right. So, over the last several weeks, we've been exploring what, right? On the surface, looked like several completely different topics, right? If you joined me before the intro video rolled there, right, then you already have kind of a heads up on this, but let's get everybody else caught up, right? So again, we covered things that, again, if we're just looking at surface topics, they just look like they're different. They're not connected, right? Again, we talked about why copying a master doesn't make you one, right? No matter how much you try, you just can't do it. Once somebody says it was right? Stop trying to copy my movement. You can't do it. Okay. It wasn't a competition. It wasn't a challenge, right? It was truth. Okay. We explored this concept of hapol, 8 directions in this context, but not merely 8 directions, right? But as 8 ways. Where normally when we introduce that to new students, it's introduced as like different ways of moving to avoid things that are coming in. But this time we looked at it as 8 directions or attack vectors where things could come in, right? Can we deal with more than just 1 or 2? What if the attacker's not in front of us, right? But the attack comes in front of us. Shit, Sensei, how does that happen? Okay, well, a basic bear hug happens just like that, right? He's behind you, but the force and pressure that's first noticed comes around from the front, okay? We did an interesting drill during the Friday masterclass that kind of woke people up, where we use this basic ikichigai setup, right? Ikichigai is, there's some kata across the Bujinkan lineages called ikichigai. Ikichigae, ikichigai, right? Ikichigai, though, is not something special, right? It's a everyday Japanese phrase. It means to pass by, right? Now, that's typically what the setups are about. But what we did was I created a drill where I had students. One student stood still. The other student just kind of walked on by, right? But at a certain point on walking by, what they did was they hooked a punch around, so the body's over here, the fist was coming in here. And before I gave them any answers, I let them try to resolve that problem for themselves. Okay, that kind of attack is reminiscent of something called the knockout game that was popular, and I hear it's coming back. Just sucker punches and those kind of things that I just don't think enough people are practicing because, well, that's not what the kata looks like, Sensei. And again, Alan knows what I'm going to say right now. It's not my fault. So anyway, but we talked about the 8 directions, not just in how we can move, but in how these were directions that an attack could come in, right? But we also took a look at them as 8 ways of changing your perception, or just including more and more perspectives or angles that we could come at things from, so we weren't as likely to be stuck when a problem arose, right? What else do we do? We discussed how the attack doesn't always come from where you're looking, right? We've talked about why our assumptions about conflict often become bigger obstacles that our opponents are, right? Each week we've looked at a different piece of the puzzle, right? But the more I've thought about and reflected on those discussions, right, the more I feel the need to point out that they all point toward the same invisible problem, right? I don't want to assume or expect or whatever that folks are going to get that. Right? So, what is that problem, right? Believe it or not, it's not poor technique. It's not lack of talent. It's not even lack of effort, right? A lot of people are putting a ton of effort into things. Even that when we were doing things over the past week in the dojo. I was giving students kamae transitional patterns. So I would link like three kamae together, right? And they had to do it in a particular order, as well as relationship, outside the attack, inside the attack, whatever, right? And so what was happening very often was that people were avoiding in kamae just fine, right? Couldn't hit their damn angles to save their life, right? Might get the first one, might get the second one. But at some point, things fell apart or got tight or got whatever, right? And so my point was, look, you guys are all good at evasion. You're all good at avoiding. Yeah, but since, I mean, like, we're not gonna, they didn't say this, right? They know better, but they didn't say, but you're limiting us and you're forcing us to do it a certain way. Isn't it okay that we just get out of the way? Yeah, sometimes, right? But then I put things into context and I said, okay, what if your wife is standing right there? Okay, he throws a punch, you move over here, bad guy's now facing her, can't hit you. So what if you just punched her in the face? Okay, or the way you move, you stumble over her, or because she's paralyzed with fright, you run into her, and now neither of you can move. Okay, sometimes you have to move a very specific way because of conditions, the environment, whatever. Okay, and so again, they were very, very good at evading to kamae, all of them, right? None of them had poor technique, right? They had talent, right? Lots of effort. But these little patterns were uncovering movement issues, balance issues, weight transition issues, things like that, right? But they also pointed to something much quieter, much more subtle, maybe, right? Much more hidden, right? Something that often shows up disguised as experience. It's familiarity. Okay. Now, before anybody misunderstands, right, throws this, whatever, right? I'm not saying that familiarity is bad. Far from it. Okay. Without familiarity, you'd be wandering around every day, not being able to find your home, your car, your family, whatever. Okay. But without familiarity, right, we'd never develop confidence, right? Without repetition, we'd never build dependable skills, right? Without experience, we constantly feel like beginners. Not that a lot of us don't anyway, but, right? Familiarity is necessary. It's an important piece of the puzzle. Okay, not saying that it isn't. Well, then if it's important, sensei, how the flock, right? That can be one of the most dangerous problems, right? Well, yeah, it's necessary. But like many powerful things, it has a shadow. Maybe it has a dark side. Anyway, right? So, and that's what I want to explore tonight, right? That's what I want to explore during this episode, right? Because familiarity has a way of becoming something else. It has a way of becoming assumption, right? We all know about assumptions, right? Okay. Assumptions have an interesting thing about them. The moment we stop questioning them is the moment we stop noticing them. Okay? Good question. Have you ever been driving home from work or wherever, right? And suddenly realize you don't remember the last several miles? Right? Looking around thinking, did I hear something bounce off the car? Did I feel a little bump kind of thing? You're where you're supposed to be, right? Which means your body made all the right turns. You had to obey the traffic lights. You stayed in your lane, right? You even avoided the distracted driver or drifted a little too close. But your conscious mind wasn't really engaged with the process anymore. Why? Because the route had become familiar. Right? Familiarity allows us to run on autopilot. Right? Your brain compressed thousands of tiny decisions into a few large patterns. Now, most of the time, it's a cool thing about the brain, most of the time, that is incredibly useful. Because if we had to micromanage every little data point or every piece of information that came in during a day, we'd all be drooling, bluthering idiots in a corner, completely overwhelmed, like somebody with ADHD, 100-fold over, right? But imagine if one of those patterns suddenly changed, right? A child runs onto the road, a detour appears, a bridge is closed, right? Next thing, your road closed sign suddenly shows up, right? If your assumptions are stronger than your observation, your reaction time will be significantly delayed. Okay? The hell does anything that have to do with why we're here? Well, it's because the same thing happens in martial arts, right? We're humans. We have human brains. Doesn't matter what we're doing. It's still the same thing, right? Same thing happens in the martial arts. And I'd argue the same thing happens in leadership, in relationships, business, raising children, almost every important skill we develop over a lifetime. Okay. That's why Hudson Sensei very often would teach something, right? He'd demonstrate techniques, and then he'd have this lecture moment during class, right? This is where the KUDEN kind of comes out, right? And then he would say, not just a good martial arts idea, good life idea, right? So what I like to do is I'd like to start this episode with a simple question, right? And don't answer too quickly, because I think most of us will answer it automatically. Here's the question. What does it actually mean to know something? Not recognize it, not remember it, not repeat it, not teach it, to truly know it. Think about how often we use that word, right? I know that kata, I know that principle, I know that person, I know how this works. Really? Or do we know enough to stop asking questions about that person, place, or thing? Because those aren't necessarily the same thing. Do we know enough? Do we have enough information to allow us to make assumptions that provide for comfort and predictability and enough certainty that we don't have to do anything else? Okay. So before I go any further, I'd like to hear from some of you, right? Jump into the comments. Okay. When you hear someone say, I know that, what do you think they usually mean? Okay. There's a question again. When you hear someone say, I know that, what do you think they usually mean? Right? Do they mean, I've seen it before, or I've seen them before? I can do it. I've experienced it. I understand it deeply. what, right? Or maybe something entirely different. What do you think? How do you process it, right? When somebody says, I understand that, if they were saying that to you, what do you think it means? Okay. I'll give you just a minute to respond. Okay. James, anybody else sign in while we're waiting for some comments to pop up? Anybody else join us? Hit the hard stuff. Get myself some more Diet Pepsi here.
Well, numbers went up. Nobody else has checked in though.
Just a bunch of stalkers and lurkers. It's all right. Anything? James, what do you think most people mean, or how do you translate it when somebody says, I know that?
Yeah. I guess depending on what it's about. I mean, if we're just talking about something,
Sure,
I
yeah.
assume that like they've run into this thing or idea or whatever before and have some understanding of what it is, what it does, how it works, what it's about, that kind of thing.
They create certain assumptions, right? I mean, if you were at work, you take care of a bunch of stuff around the university there, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get somebody helping you, and you say, hey, do you know how to operate that machine? And they go, yeah, I know that. Right? What do you think they mean?
I think they have done it before, and I don't need to explain how it works or what to do with it. Or, like, this is a piece of equipment, how to start it, how to run it, how to use it, and then usually very quickly they will either prove that to be correct or an incorrect assumption on my part.
Right, but the initial assumption isn't just that they've seen somebody turn it on or whatever, right?
Right. So they have actual experience with it to some degree. They've used it before.
Yeah. Now I don't think your son drives, but I think you've helped other people learn to drive and whatnot. Have you ever experienced anybody? We'll call them a teenager, right? Who is familiar with the way a car operates, the way it gets turned on, the way steering must happen, whatever. They know there's an accelerator pedal, brake pedal, and all that. And well, yeah, I know how it works, right? Can't be that difficult. And then they put it in drive, and within like 2.2 seconds, right, they're already stomping on the brake or whatever because it's not like the video game, right? So, yeah,
they know
absolutely. Anybody else?
The theory of it.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm just saying, when I run into that, I'm like, like I would say like the theory of it, the information about it, but you don't have the experience side of it.
You've seen the actions done, but right? Yeah, you have information, and that's really part of the paradigm, right? Information is not knowing, but in everyday parlance, the way most people talk, those words are swapped easily, right? Information, knowledge, understanding. It's like they're all thrown into the same synonyms. That's right. That's right. Not homonyms. Synonyms. That's right.
So, a couple people kicked in. Alan said it because it's on my Rolodex cards.
Don't talk to Alan anymore tonight.
Sorry, Alan, you can turn off.
That didn't take long, did it? Toss him a crayon and call it a night. All right. Wow.
Kevin said pattern recognition.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Just because he already had it in there, I'll leave it slide. Alan said because they may have done that before or even studied it. And Kyle said, I think most people mean they've seen it before. Okay.
Right. So you brought something up, right? It's a good point. And I like that distinction. I think, if I remember correctly, you used the word comfortable, right? They've done it before. they're not going to have a problem with it,
Mm.
right? They should just need to know where they're going with it and what the task is,
Sure.
right? Okay. So, but comfortable, right? Remember that word, right? Because we're going to come back to comfortable in just a little while. Okay. Um, so going back to things, right? One of the things I love about these live conversations is that we all come in carrying different assumptions already. Some are similar, right? Some are different. Here's another one. Some people that they don't answer or toss anything into the comments because they might be driving, they might be otherwise engaged. I get that, right? So I make certain assumptions, right? But it's based on experience. Some people don't respond because they may be assuming there's a trick question in there, or they want to be wrong, or they don't want to be called out, or all kinds of things, right? But everybody comes carrying different assumptions already, right? Which is why in a lot of these episodes, what do? I define words that we're dealing with if I think that there could be um, kind of a wide range, right? Or definitions that if somebody is on the wrong one, then clarity is not going to happen, right? James, you know, I do that all the time.
Sure.
How I do it with kanji to make sure people understand what a friggin' word is. Yeah. So, and sometimes hearing someone else describe the exact same thing from a completely different perspective is enough to make us realize that there was another layer the whole time, right? Waiting to be discovered, waiting to be seen, or, you know, wow, I never thought about it that way. I mean, hell, how often is class like that, right? I know when I go train with my teachers, right? And wow, one, I didn't even know you had that body part. Two, I didn't know you could make it hurt like that. And three, I didn't know you could move or make somebody collapse, like whatever, right? I never thought about it like that, right? And students say that all the time as well. Okay, it's exactly what happened to me over the years training with Hatsumi Sensei, training with some of these other master teachers, right? I'd return from a seminar or I'd return from Japan thinking, no, I get it, right? No, I understand, right? Only to go back a couple months later, year later, whatever, and find out that, yeah, I hadn't understood nearly as much as I thought I did, right? And it's not because Sensei changed the lesson, right? It's because I changed. Because a lot of the demonstrations, in all honesty, I mean, there was one point in my training where I thought, man, this is all starting to look the same. I mean, this is it, right? Which is a surefire red flag for me. But I did kind of run into that, and I didn't like it. But to go back and realize, shit, I missed something. Wait, I didn't even. How did I miss that? Right. So it wasn't because he did anything differently. I mean, he might have, but I think the biggest part of it was because I changed. I changed, right? And that realization may be one of the greatest gifts that a teacher can give a student. New insight, right? In our Mikyo training, we have the Jusan Butsu, right? The 13 Buddhism Bodhisattvas. If you're a little squeamish about those terms, what we're talking about is states of understanding and activities that produce that understanding. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so in that, right, the stage right after finding a teacher, right, who is actually their role is to explain to you or to open you up to shit you can't see, right? Or to help you make sense out of these little moments that you had, right? So the very next character, so Fudomyo is the first character, and Fudomyo represents the world shaking you awake from your everyday I know that kind of thing, right? To get you to pay attention. And then you find somebody to explain that to you. Could be a formal teacher or somebody that has experienced that before or whatever, right? In this case, it's a teacher. And so the next character is this character that represents transcendental wisdom. And I'm not talking about big woo-woo stuff. I'm talking about pointing to things that are beyond what you're able to see in the moment, right? You just never noticed before, right? Or the lessons or the science behind why something works, or things like that, right? And then they just go on from there. And it's a process, right? It's just this map of this process of attaining enlightenment and being able to produce results with it and stuff like that, right? So anyway, I think that realization that the lessons from the teacher don't necessarily change. They do sometimes, right? But what I've come to realize is that there's, I don't know, handful of principles and concepts that's at the heart of everything else that we do. And until I can see that, until the teacher shows me enough freaking different techniques that my brain finally catches the pattern, right? Alan mentioned, right? I told you not to talk to him, James, but Alan mentioned pattern recognition. And when that happens, then something changes, right? We change, okay? So the moment you realize there's another layer, this is the big thing, right? Where the teacher throws a curveball at you, a different technique, a kamae string, right? That you have to do the pattern. You have to do it, right? But your attacker can throw straight punches, hook punch, whatever, right? And you have to find the mark, right? You have to do this one, then you have to transition to this one, then you have to, right? Okay. Until the teacher does something like that, right? Or it's just until the moment you realize there's another layer, right? The moment that happens, curiosity returns, right? Curiosity is the thing that makes us go, what makes that work? I wonder what would happen if. Those kind of things, right? And curiosity is the antidote to complacency. Okay? So let's start peeling back those layers, right? Because I think one of the smallest words in the English language, know, K-N-O-W, right, may be hiding one of the biggest misunderstandings in martial arts. Okay? And if you're not studying Bujinkan stuff or whatever, that's absolutely fine, right? Whatever it is that you're studying, there's no difference, right? The principle is the same. The form can change 500 to 1,000 different ways, but the principle stays the same. Okay? So let's begin with that word. Know, K-N-O-W. Okay? Because I think most of us use it every day without ever asking or being clear about what it actually means. And I know, right? You can do, there's a word again, right? I know. You could do a Google search. You could look it up in Webster's Dictionary, whatever. Okay? But what does it actually mean? Okay? Before I do that, right? Before we get too far into tonight's discussion, if these kinds of conversations are helping you see your training differently, remember that this is exactly the kind of exploration we'll be doing during our fall intensive this October. Right? The theme for this year is lessons from the sword. Okay. And we will certainly be working with the sword. We'll be learning techniques, kata, movement, but the real focus is in learning to see the universal principles hidden beneath them. And I think the sword, other than the cool factor, drawing people in, right, like a moth to a flame, that cool factor, I think the sword makes a great focal point or tool for this because of its size and leverage and whatnot. It's big enough to expose even the smallest problems. Okay. But again, the real focus is on learning to see the universal principles. Okay. Because that's where long-term growth really begins. Okay. So if you're not already signed up for it, I know Kyle is, Alan is, James, I think you and Aaron are in for camp, I think. Well, it's not camp anymore. It's an intensive. Anyway, either way, it's October 16th to the 18th. Okay. If you want more information about it, you can go over to onlineninjaacademy.com/events. And there's a little blurb there. The full page isn't set up yet. I know I said I'd have it set up this last week. Hit me. But either way, right? And since we're already thinking ahead, right? Don't forget that our annual New Year's Daikomyosai is scheduled for the weekend of January 8th to the 10th of 2027. Okay. Where we'll be revisiting the fundamentals. Okay. Not beginner techniques. Okay. People hear fundamentals, they hear basics, they hear that's for the beginners. No. Okay. We're going to be revisiting them from an entirely different level of understanding. Okay. Daikomyosai is one of my favorite weekends of the year. It's one of the first ones of the year. But it's one of my favorite because it establishes kind of I used to call it our kickoff, our New Year's kickoff seminar, right? It establishes kind of a restart or a way to set our resolve. Okay. Those New Year's resolutions. Anyway, as a part of that weekend, we actually do a New Year's Goma. It is it's a fire ceremony kind of thing. It's an active meditation that's borrowed from Mikyo that students set goals that are ginormous, but the only caveat, whatever, right, is that they realized before December 31st of that year. Okay. And it's always cool when a student comes up to me and says, hey, I did that. Remember that thing we did? Okay. Yeah. A couple of times it's happened in Japan. One of the times was on Togakushi Mountain. So that was really cool. Anyway, so, but it's also one of my favorite weekends because it's amazing how beginner techniques stop looking like beginner techniques once a student's perception changes, right? Anyway, I'll remind you again before we finish tonight, but I wanted to mention it now because what we're discussing isn't just theory, it's exactly how we'll be training together. Okay? All right, one last call, James. Anybody else jump in before I don't talk to anybody for a while? I mean, I'll be talking to you, but...
just Camping Woodchuck over on YouTube said it sounds like you're referring to the Sanshin of training through boredom.
No, we talked about boredom a couple of episodes ago. But stay with us. Maybe that'll clear up. Okay? So, again, what does it mean to, quote unquote, know something? Right? So I spent a few minutes talking about this word, right, that we all use probably every single day, right? The word know, K-N-O-W, right? If you're not a native English speaker, well, you might have to look that up a little bit, but you probably already understand, okay? But think about how often that comes up in a conversation, okay? Somebody says, I know, Or, oh yeah, I know. Or I already know that, right? I know this kata. I know that principle. I know Hatsumi Sensei. I know the Gyaku. I know Ichimonji. I know the Sanshin. Whatever. Okay. The interesting thing is those are all perfectly normal statements. There's no real problem with them, is there? And yet they may all mean something completely different. Okay. Again, if you were on before the intro video ran, then you heard this, but I'll ask it again. Okay. For the rest of you, suppose I ask you, do you know Abraham Lincoln? And again, most people would do what? Smile, chuckle, whatever. No, right? Of course not. Right? You've read about him. You've seen pictures. Maybe you've studied history, but you don't know Abraham Lincoln. Okay. But what if I change the question? Do you know Hatsumi Sensei? Some people would answer yes. Some people would answer no. Now that we've set this up, some people their mind would want to say yes because of the familiarity, but now it's being swayed, right? But why? Okay. Could somebody say, yes, I know him, but maybe not to the same degree as somebody else? Of course, right? Some people have attended a seminar, a taikai, or gone to Japan. Okay. Some have trained for decades. Some have shared meals. Some have traveled with him. Right? Some have only watched videos. Right? So they know who he is. Every one of those people has had exposure. But exposure isn't the same thing as relationship. Okay? It's kind of like the difference between learning Sanshin off of a video, since somebody brought it up, and working on it in class and the teacher coming over and grabbing you and repositioning your body on the correct angle relative to your partner. Okay? So let's do this. Let's make it even more personal. Okay? Do you know your spouse? How about your best friend? How about your children? Okay? I certainly hope your answer is yes. But here's another question. Do you know them today the same way you knew them 10 years ago? Hopefully not. But the fact is that a lot of people are still carrying around the equivalent of a Polaroid snapshot of their friend from a year ago, 5 years ago, whatever. Okay. And they're still interacting with them the same way. But again, hopefully your relationship with these people, right, it's not the same. Okay. Because if the relationship is healthy, you're still discovering them. You're discovering new aspects or things about them every day, right? You're still learning. You're still asking questions, right? You're still being surprised. Like, I didn't know you like that, right? The relationship continues to unfold, to grow, to deepen, right? And I think that's a great model for training too, because techniques, kata, principles, right, should be approached the same way. Not as things we've eventually finished learning, but as relationships we continue developing. Okay. One of the biggest mistakes I see students make, and honestly, I think instructors make it just as often, is believing that familiarity means completion, right? Or proficiency at a given level means, okay, you got it, Okay. Somebody saying, I've learned that. I've moved beyond that, right? I've already taken that class. I've already learned that weapon, right? I already know that kata. Okay. whereas some students have said, if I have to do that technique one more time, I'm going to scream. And then I say, really? Well, go ahead, get it out of your system. Because if there wasn't more to learn, or if you were already doing it correctly, we wouldn't be doing this one. We'd be doing something else. Okay. So, do we really know these things? Or have we simply become familiar enough that our brains stop looking for anything new? And I'm not talking, for clarity, I'm not talking about boredom. I'm talking about comfort. It's not the same thing. If somebody's still doing the same thing and they're bored with it, well, then they've been comfortable for too long to where, I don't know what, there's nothing new, so ego's not being entertained. I don't know. But either way, it comes down to the same thing, right? We've hit a point where our brain stopped looking for anything new, right? And this brings us to recognition, right, versus knowledge, okay? And I think that's important, right, to make that distinction, right? The first level is simply recognition. We could also call it information, right? We learned something, okay? You've seen it before. You recognize the name, you recognize the movement, you recognize the shape, the form, whatever, right? If I perform or demonstrate omotegyaku as an example, right? Omotegyaku de waza, whatever you want to call it, right? Most experienced martial artists who have that in their repertoire, right? Most of them in a given class where that was being demonstrated, right, will immediately recognize it. Okay. But recognition tells us almost nothing. Okay. I can recognize a Ferrari, but that doesn't mean I know how to drive one correctly, safely, without killing myself. Right. I can recognize a violin. Right. I may have the gist of how that bow and catgut and whatnot are drawn across a string, but that certainly doesn't mean I can perform in a concerto, right? Or perform a concerto, right? Recognition simply tells us, I've encountered this before. Nothing more. I may have done it a couple of times, right? I can recognize it when I see it. Right? I know Jumonji no Kata from Ichimonji no Kata. I know Ichimonji no Kata from Seion from Tangeki from Nichigeki, whatever, right? But that's it, okay? Fortunately, or unfortunately, our brains are extremely efficient. Sometimes too efficient, right? The moment we recognize something, our minds often conclude, oh, I knew this. And that's where curiosity, growth, or next steps really start to disappear. Here's a fun fact for you. Have you ever gone online and you bought something, right? You bought this thing and you're like, oh, wow, that's a lot. Okay, only $27. Yeah, click, right? And next thing you know, you're offered an upsell, right? Let's say you bought a program with 25 killer self-defense techniques and stuff, and it's 37 cents, whatever, right? Well, that's awesome. Click, right? Now, this doesn't work on everybody, but if The next thing that's offered, I'll give you a more real world kind of thing, right? I have a condensed version of the Ninja no Hachimon. It's in ebook, and there's an audio recording that comes with it. So somebody could either read it or they could play it while they're driving, whatever. Okay. And it's very condensed, but it's enough for a lot of people. I also have what started out as a 10-week coaching program where each week we went into each of the 8 required or prerequisite gates of authentic ninja training that was required in ancient Japan for any school that was professing to teach ninjutsu had to be teaching those 8 as a minimum, right? Now, I know Togakure Ryu has 18, yeah, and those 8 are in there, and then there's more, and there's more than the 18 too. But anyway, but here's an interesting thing, and this was borne out through experimentation. If I were to offer we'll call it the mini course, the book and audio, right? The audio, we'll just that, right? And then after somebody bought it, you go, hey, if you want more, here's this whole thing. We dive into each one of these things, and we don't just look at it from the why it's a part of the set and all this kind of stuff, but we also look at it from the principal perspective and what that would look like in today's world. Not making shit up, not making up another ninjutsu style, not guessing, whatever, right? Using the same principles and the same strategic thinking that put that core 8 together. What would that look like today, right? So here's this thing, right? Full, robust program. Next to no one takes me up on it. And here's the fun fact, right? It's also the reason why when people buy programs or they buy DVDs or whatever, okay, they almost never go through the program. And if they do, it's either really quickly or it's the first lesson or so, and then they promise themselves they'll come back to it, and then whatever, right? The reason that happens is because we have this thing like, I want to know. Awesome. Great. As soon as we buy the program, the brain goes, now I have the knowledge. I don't personally know it yet, but I have it. And the brain, in its efficiency, ticks off the. Of course, it gets in our way. And of course, enlightenment is the act of knowing that the mind does, so we don't fall into that trap. Right? Because as soon as we do that, as soon as our mind concludes, I now know. I now have the knowledge. I know this, whatever, right? The thing that allows for growth and exploration and study and deep dives and stuff like that mastery requires, curiosity, that's where it starts to disappear. Okay? So, but that's recognition, right? The next level is what I typically call knowledge, right? I normally break this down into information, knowledge, wisdom. You can say recognition, knowledge, understanding, which is what I'm using for this one. But knowledge means that I can reliably reproduce something. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to think about how to do it. Okay? Show me the movement, and I will practice until I can perform it, right? Ichimonji, tying shoes, whatever, okay? Teach me the sequence. I practice it enough, and I can remember it, right? Give me the kata, And with time, I'll be able to demonstrate it. That I know it. I don't have to think about where my feet go. I don't have to think about the angle. I don't have to think about which kama I'm in. None of that, right? I free up mental bandwidth because, like, I'm not just still trying to make it happen. I don't have to think about it. It just comes out. Like, if you speak English or any language, right? If you're still learning it, you can recognize it by ear, right? I can recognize the Japanese language from the Korean language, from the Chinese language, from Thai, Vietnamese, whatever, right? I can pick it out. Okay? I don't speak much of it. I know just enough Japanese to not get lost when I'm there. Okay. But don't ask me to hold a major conversation, right? But if I took more time, if I had more time and I, did my thing, then all that would change, right? But we're talking about the difference between having learned how to, let's say, tie your shoes, and you're still like, for those of you on audio, I'm like, got my tongue sticking out and trying to remember like how many times I twist them together, and then I pull, and I'm like, I wrap the one lace around my finger, and then I go around, the bunny runs around the tree and goes in the hole, and the difference between that and being at the dojo and getting changed after class and having a conversation with somebody, tying my shoes at the same time and not looking at my shoes. That's the difference. Okay. And that's an important step. Okay. This it's absolutely necessary, right? But sorry to say, it still isn't understanding. Okay. Think about children learning multiplication, right? Remember having to memorize the times tables, right? When you were in school, right? From everything from what's 0 times 0 all the way up to 12 times 12. I mean, if you had anything bigger than that, that was what I had to memorize. But I had memorized 0 times 1, 0 times 2, and then 1 times 1, 1 times 2, all the way up, right? A child might learn that, right? They might learn that 7 times 8 equals 56. That is information. But once they memorize 7 times 8 equals 56 and can call it up mentally every time, perfect, right? That's knowledge. But if I ask why does 7 times 8 equals 56? Why does 7 times 8 equal 56? Many children can't answer. I'd be hedging my bets to say that most adults can't answer. Okay? They know the answer. It's like doing any of the kata, like doing any of the sanshin, like doing any of the ichimonji no kata, jumonji no kata, whatever, right? They know the answer. They don't yet understand the mathematics behind it. They don't understand numbers and how they work. They just memorized a thing, right? Martial arts often works exactly the same way, right? Students memorize a movement. They reproduce the movement. They pass a test on the movement, right? But when the situation changes, when the attack angle, level, or the speed changes, shit, everything falls apart, right? Students at Warrior Concepts learn as a part of their rank progression as well, Japanese vocabulary. Part of it is because it wakes up a certain part of the brain that is actually tied to taijutsu. And Japanese is one of the only languages that are processed on the right side of the brain, where music and abstract things and whatnot are processed, as opposed to the left brain, where most languages are processed, right? But they learn Japanese vocabulary, right? So they learn, right? They know that dojo means training hall. Shitsure shimasu means please excuse me for my rudeness. Onegai shimasu means please assist me, right? But when I ask, how do you say, please excuse me for my rudeness in Japanese? They freeze up. Minds go blank. Why is that? Right? If I say, what does shitsure shimasu mean in English? They'll go, please excuse me for my rudeness. If I say, great, okay. What does sensei nure mean in English? Bow to the teacher. Show respect to the teacher. Great. And then I turn around and go, how do you say please, as in please give me something, please help me, please assist me? How do you say that in Japanese? Like I see deer in the headlights. Okay. Why? Right? It's because memorized answers depend on familiar questions. The brain ties the answer to the question, ties the name to the face. There's lots of examples, right? But real conflict, reality itself, doesn't ask familiar questions. There's always some kind of variable, some kind of variation, some kind of difference going on, right? And that's why someone can perform a kata perfectly, beautifully, right? Against a classic ski in the dojo and struggle the moment that timing changes, they're doing randori, distance changes, the arc of the punch changes, the attacker's energy changes, the environment changes. Shit. Okay? So the technique wasn't wrong. Okay? People often write that up to, I knew this shit wouldn't work in a real fight. Okay? There's nothing wrong with the technique. It works and has for centuries. Okay? The knowledge simply hadn't yet become something more. Understanding. Okay? People know that when a punch comes in, we move to ichimonji or seigan or whatever at a 45-degree angle. That's proper tai sabaki. That's proper naname. But somebody who understands what the model is teaching, where it's teaching from, and what you're supposed to do with that afterwards, understands that all of that is correct, given that I start from a static position, the attack comes in on a straight line, ski, right? And there's nothing else in my way or no other conditions that I have to account for. Awesome. Now we can start training. Because once we understand that now, and I understand that correct naname, that angling, right? People just lump that into tai sabaki, but it's naname. Then, right, what I have to understand is that correct tai sabaki, correct naname is angled to the attack. It's not moving 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 2 degrees, 270 degrees. It might be, but it's not that. It's angled to the line of the attack and profiled or properly aligned and properly distanced from the attacker and their next weapon online that can come at me. Once I understand that, the attacker can throw all kinds of different angles. And I'll be able to hit my mark. Sometimes I have to move 90 degrees. Sometimes I have to move, 270, whatever, right? Because I'm no longer on the beginner's mentality. I know that ruffles people's feathers, right? You know what my belt rank is? I don't care. Not my words. Hatsumi Sensei's words. If you think a certain way, this is beginner mind, and not in a good way. This is where they are, right? If you think and process things on this level, it's next stage, intermediate stuff. If you think on this stage, you're here, this stage, on this stage, on the okay. So that's what growth means. Not learning how to make the capital letter A better and better and faster and faster and faster. I mean, okay, right? So with understanding, what changes? What changes is that understanding asks different questions. Right? Not what do I do, but why does this work? When does it work? When doesn't it work? What problem is this actually solving? What lessons am I supposed to be extracting from this basic model? Because one of the biggest things I learned from master teachers in Japan is that learning the model isn't the lesson. Learning the kata, not the lesson. If we were going to say, this is step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, that kind of thing within the growth and learning from things, learning the kata is step 0. We have to learn it. We have to learn, we have to know it, right? Be able to do it without, so we can extract the things we're supposed to understand that is teaching. Okay? So if I were to ask, what are the Sanshin no Kata teaching on any level? Because the name changes, but there's 3 levels of transmission, right? For each of the 5 models. Okay? So what do they teach at any level? Okay? What does each one of the models teach? What do successive models, Sui no Kata, Ka no Kata, whatever, right? What do they expect that you've pulled from Chi no Kata or the other kata that came before? I know you can learn them in any order, but we'll leave it at that because it's not a lesson about Sanchi. Okay. Understanding, right? Ask different questions, right? What assumptions does this particular movement depend on to work at this point in this technique? What principle remains true even if the movement changes completely? Right? Those are completely different questions. And they lead to a completely different type of training, even though class looks the same. Because it's not that the techniques are different. They might be. It's what we're looking at. It's what we can see, right? It's what we're trying to pull from it. It's what we're trying to, what's that word again? Understand, right? One of the things I noticed after years of traveling to Japan was that Hatsumi Sensei rarely seemed interested in whether or not we could copy his movement. Right? Think about that for a moment. Okay? Here we were, students from all over the world, desperately trying to imitate every tiny detail. Foot placement, his timing, his posture, his hand position, movement, right? And almost every trip, he'd change something. And then he'd say, don't try to copy my movement. You won't get it. Copy the feeling instead. What the flock does that mean? Okay? I mean, I know now, but, right? And that frustrated people. It frustrated me, right? And then I realized something. He wasn't changing the lesson. He was changing our dependence on familiarity. He was making it difficult for ego to lock on and crystallize something that can't be crystallized out on the street. Kata are designed to help us make sense out of chaos, not the kata is not the fight. any more than the dojo is the fight environment. My students learn that very quickly. I'll put obstacles out in the middle of the frickin' floor for them to trip over or run into or tighten the space. Right? Because one of those assumptions from training in a dojo or an open field, or, people like to clear space, so run into or trip over anything. And that's important in the beginning. Right? But that also assumes that you can decide what the fight location is. This is not high school. Meet you at the parking lot after school. Okay? And besides that, that's a ego-driven fight between two bulls trying to prove a point. Right? That's not the criminal attacker, the thug, the mugger, the rapist, whatever, that is going to choose the location because it puts you at a disadvantage and him at a greater advantage. Right? But either way, right? He was changing our dependence on familiarity. The movement had never been the point. The understanding was the point. And if we become too comfortable copying yesterday's answer, today's lesson had to look different. Not to confuse us, to wake us up. Right? The amygdala is tuned to new things to keep it awake. Otherwise, we go into a click whir thing. I mean, it's the nature of our brain. All this stuff is natural. We need to understand this, right? All of this is natural. So this is not a judgment about anybody. This is not pointing out errors or anything like that. This is not a statement that, students suck. I've had people say that, right? Well, we get it. The students suck. No. Students try their hardest. Now, the lazy ones and all that, I'm not talking about them. I'm actually talking about the ones that are sincerely trying to get things. Okay? These things are natural. Our brains are wired a certain way. We have an area behind the ears, behind the mastoid processes on both sides of our friggin' head called Broca's region. Okay? If you have ever heard your mom, a teacher, your grandma, whatever say, you don't listen to anything. Right? It goes in one ear and out the other. Okay? That's Broca's region at work. Broca's region, they've determined, or they've discovered that Broca's region's job is to filter out 99.8% of the shit that comes in every day. That's the same as it is every day. So that your amygdala and hypothalamus can stay focused on something that could kill you, eat you, screw up your day, whatever. So the reason why we're always attracted to the new shiny object is because without things like Mikyo and meditation and mindfulness work and meso, right? Meso, M-E-S-O, is what we call in our lineages meditation, right? Mind work, right? Without that, we're just going to fall prey to the brain's it's evolutionary wiring to shut everything else out that is normal, commonplace, familiar, whatever, so that it can pay attention to shit that might eat us. Historically, we're eons away from the cave. Evolutionarily, 3-4 steps. Okay? This is important to understand. If you're a teacher, it's even more important to understand. There's a concept in teaching that is called disguising repetition. Okay? One of the reasons why a lot of teachers lose students is because they either do one of two things. They either do the same shit all the time with minor differences, right? And that creates boredom because the students' minds are looking for, what's next? Okay? So can you have them do the same skill or the same technique or whatever, 5, 10, 50 different ways. They're learning the same skill, but the primitive brain doesn't see that. Or they do the opposite, which is whatever the hell they want, and nothing's ever the same. And so there's nothing for the student to anchor to. And so therefore there's no recognition that leads to knowledge, that leads to understanding. That only works for a small percentage of the population who are naturally intuitive learners. I just happen to be one of them. But that's not, if I taught that way, I wouldn't have the size of the dojo we have. I would have a very small group, like most groups. I'm not ringing my bell. It's just different skills, different understanding. Okay. Anyway, James, any questions or comments pop up at this point? I didn't mean to yell that. Why did I yell? Maybe it's because you were invisible and I couldn't see you. I don't know.
No questions. Just
I don't even do that when I go to Japan. I don't do that when I travel. You know, tourists do that. Like, the person doesn't understand your language.
Louder.
Where is the bathroom? Like, you can shove your language into their brain. Wow. Yeah. Hello. He doesn't understand. He doesn't comprehend your language. He's not fucking deaf.
Maybe
he
now.
might be more so now. Wow. Anyway, so anything?
No comments. Just Trinity checked in.
Awesome. Trinity's the brain specialist when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Careful though; she'll use it for nefarious reasons against you. That's why James stays hidden in his little box right there.
I'm stuck here.
Anyway, what's that?
Yeah, I'm stuck here. She stuck me in the box.
Yeah. Stuck in the box. Just a little. Anyway, so if recognition isn't enough and knowledge isn't the finish line, right? How does understanding actually develop? I mean, I think it's a good question, don't you? Right? But here's the thing. I used to think that it happened by collecting more techniques. Right? And then I learned so many techniques that I couldn't fucking practice them all. I have notebooks full of techniques. I pull them out every once in a while, dust them off, use them in a seminar, something like that. But holy shit, right? I've had students ask me this. Like, I'm learning all this stuff, but like, I don't have enough time in a day to practice everything at this point. So why do we have all these techniques? The answer is because we need examples, many examples, of how these base principles go together. Like I said, there's a handful of them, right? And once we hit a tipping point, if we're truly focused in the right place, if we truly understand, we'll hit a tipping point and not need techniques anymore. We can still use them. Talk about that here in a bit. But what we use them for will be different than what we started out learning them for. Okay? So, but like I said, I used to think that understanding happened by collecting more and more techniques, right? And when you don't learn more techniques and whatever, and that's where boredom and complacency or we just jump ship and go to some other art because now those things are readily available, or they're the shiny new object or whatever. Okay. But that's not what I think anymore. Right. I have thought for a long time, and I believe this to be true, that it happens by changing the kinds of questions that we ask at each level. Okay. And I think Omote Gyaku may be one of the best examples that I can give, right? Because most people know it, right? I mean, I could use Ichimonji no kata, Jinmonji, whatever, okay? But I'm going to stick on Omote Gyaku. It's one of the best examples I can give because the technique, right, the introductory technique, the model, never changes. Only the person executing it, performing it, demonstrating it, whatever. Only they do. Okay? So let's take a look at that. Okay? Remember earlier I said the technique doesn't change. I did, the students did, whatever. Okay? So one of the things that continues to fascinate me about martial arts is that the techniques don't really change. Now, before anybody jumps to the comments, yes, there are henka. There are variations. There are different schools, right? Different schools emphasize different things. Different teachers express things differently. I get it. I understand all that, right? I've been around in this martial arts since 1980. I get it, okay? I've been in the martial arts since 1975. I get it, okay? But at their heart, the kata themselves haven't changed very much. Yes, they've changed over time as armor changed, clothing changed, environment changed, right? Kosei no kamae went from something that looks almost like a bobi no kamae or like a karate pose with a fist out here and closed fist down here on the hip, whatnot. And it's, changed into what we have today and whatnot. That's a clothing. It's an evolutionary change, those kind of things, right? I know that in and of itself throws people off. What? It didn't always look the same? Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so I get those things, right? But again, at their heart, at their core, they haven't changed very much. Omote Gyaku is still Omote Gyaku. Ichimonji is still Ichimonji. Koku is still Koku, right? The kata aren't evolving. We are, or we should be, right? And I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings that students have, right? They believe they're learning new techniques. And sometimes they are. But much more often, what's happening is they're rediscovering the same technique from a completely different level of perception, right? Or from a different perspective. Okay, how would this be done close quarters in a crowd? How would this be done, against a knife or a club? How would this be done? Whatever. I mean, I've taught people how Ichimonji no kamae works in an argument when it's not a fist flying at you, when it's words. And no, you're not doing the same thing with your physical body. But the tactic, the strategy, what you're doing phase by phase, neutralizing the force of the attack, unbalancing them, identifying their weak points, right, while you're evading or while you're observing and getting information about them. And then you disrupt them. You undermine the structure of their argument. And then you target the things that are going to shut them down quickly. That's Ichimonji no kata. It's also 70% of the fucking techniques across all the lineages that we have. Okay. Anyway, so let me use Omote Gyaku as an example because almost everybody watching or listening, right, has at least seen it. If not, again, it's all over YouTube, right? So when you're first introduced to it, what are you trying to learn? What are you trying to learn, right? You're trying to survive, right? You're trying to remember which hand, which foot, where do I step, how do I hold the wrist, or how do I hold the hand, right? Which direction do I turn? Where does the uke go, right? It's a lot. Yes? Remember, for those of you who've been around for a while, okay? It's a lot. And that's perfectly normal. Okay? The reason that somebody stays in that state for as long as they do, having to be reminded about techniques or which way to step or whatever, because they don't practice enough. They don't do the boring redundancy thing. Yep. Boredom's a part of the process. The trick is do it even while you're bored. Do it even while you're tired. Do it even while you're pissed off. Do it even while whatever excuses people give for not doing it, because what they're really pointing to is it's somebody or something else's fault. Huh? Do it while you're blaming somebody else. Just fucking do it, right? But either way, right? That's normal, right? That confusion is normal, okay? At that point, the technique is giving you something incredibly valuable, right? What is that? It's an answer, okay? It's an answer to a problem you never faced before, or you faced it, but you didn't know what to do. Now you do, right? And that's a huge step forward, right? Not because you mastered Omotegyaku, but because uncertainty has been replaced with possibility, right? We've got something to start with, right? Now you have somewhere to begin. Yes? Right? Because the new student comes in, right? If they're self-defense oriented, they're coming in wanting to learn how to fucking survive. But their primary question is, what do I do? When this thing happens or that thing happens, what do I do? Should be the base part of the answer, because they need certainty. They need things to be predictable. They're not ready for chaos. They want to be ready for chaos, but they're not ready from a learning perspective, right? There's two completely different tracks: intent and capability, right? It's not just one linear track, right? And that's besides the Kuden side, the Shinden side, whatever, okay? So now they have some place to start, right? Now, fast forward a few months or years, right? Now the questions begin changing, right? Instead of asking, how do I do Omotegyaku? You might start asking, what if he grabs higher? Or what if he grabs over here closer to the shoulder joint and not in the middle or where I originally learned it, right? What if he resists, right? What if he punches with the other hand after he grabbed me, right? Can I enter from the outside? Can I take it from whatever, right? Can I transition into something else I've learned, right? Notice what happened, right? The technique didn't change. Omotegyaku didn't change. The questions changed. And because the questions changed, the knowledge and understanding expanded. Now, Omotegyaku isn't just the answer. It's not just an answer. It's one answer among many. One doorway into a much larger conversation, into a much bigger arena, maybe, right? And so what ends up happening is the process changes as growth occurs. The process for the beginner is very step by step. It's very set. It's very predictable, right? It's not until they've done that for a while and that's becoming easier and easier do we slip in a variation. Okay, now that you can do that, now I want you to, once you break the grip on the hand, see if you can catch that wrist and then shift into an arm bar, right? Just next, right? But they're still playing off that things are pretty predictable. I get grabbed the same way, his same hand on my wrist, same wrist, whatever, right? But when we shift, the questions have to change. Okay, the what ifs matter, right? So let's look at why this progression is so important. Because often people confuse training in Japan or training at Taikai or Daikomyosai or what they see on the videos on YouTube or the other shit that's been pirated around the internet. They think that that's a regular class. No, those training seminars are for upper level people. You can be any rank to show up for them. But Atsumi Sensei is not teaching at a white belt level or a 5th Q level or a Shodan level or whatever. He's always teaching at the highest level. And so are the other master teachers. Okay? So to try to learn from that stuff, if we're not there, now if all we, well, it's obvious. I mean, he's stepping with that foot, he's hitting with that hand. No. Okay. What is he doing? What is he disrupting? See, those are all different questions. Okay. So anyway, let's look at this, why this progression is so important, right? I often explain this to my students using a fitness or weightlifting, bodybuilding kind of analogy. Okay. So suppose someone is trying to gain some muscle, right? Or decides they want to get into shape. Okay. What do? Well, they find someone who's already built. They're already built the way they want to be themselves, right? And they ask, how'd you get where you are? Okay. What can I do? How do I start? Cool. The fit person gives them this program. Here's the exact program I followed. Here you go. Right? Here's how I trained. Here's how I ate. Here's how I recovered. Okay. So if that person, was looking to do this thing, right? If he follows that protocol consistently, there's a really good chance that he'll become fit as well to that extent, right? So a fit person, right, can make an unfit person or can help an unfit person become fit, right? A person who's at a certain level of, muscle and body build and all that can help somebody that doesn't have that get to that level. But that fit person, not the one who got fit, the one who gave him the program, that person, if they wanted to get more fit, they couldn't keep using the same program. Doesn't work. They'd have to use a different program. Okay? So the reason that program works for the person who wanted to get to that level, right, is because that program was designed to solve their current problem. They weren't fit to that level, wanted to be. So there we go, right? Now, again, either person, right? They both achieve their goal, right? They're in great shape, right? Either one, pick one, right? They decide, I'd like to add 15 more pounds of muscle. I wouldn't personally, but anyway, I'd like to add 15 more pounds of muscle, right? They can't keep following the exact same program, right? Now, if they do, they'll most likely stay healthy, right? They'll probably maintain their conditioning, but it's highly unlikely that they're going to build the additional muscle that they're now after. And the reason for that is because the program, it's not because the program was bad. The program they're following is not bad. Okay. It did exactly what it was designed to do in getting both people to that level. But the person changed. They're now fit. The problem changed. I don't want to be this fit. I want to be that fit. And the starting point changed. They're not starting from, who knows, flabby muscle, whatever, right? So since they have a different starting point, they're not in the same position they were before, right? Program has to change. The questions have to change. The training has to change. All this stuff has to change as well. Okay? Again, fit person can help somebody who's not fit get to their level of fitness, but they can't use the same program to get more fit because that protocol wasn't designed for that. Martial arts is exactly the same. The beginner's curriculum is designed to solve beginner problems. If you keep asking beginner questions after you've solved beginner problems, you shouldn't be surprised when progress slows. If you're an instructor who doesn't understand these differences, don't be surprised when students' progress slows or they quit. And they'll give you all kinds of reasons. Life change, but what I teach my instructor candidates, the very beginning of the instructor training program, is every class you teach, every student is either one step closer to their black belt or their next level of black belt, or one step closer to the door. And a huge part of that is in how you're teaching. It doesn't mean water it down, doesn't mean dumb it down, whatever. It points to the fact that the skills and knowledge that someone needs to be an instructor are not the same as the skills and knowledge the person needed to learn the shit that they're going to be teaching. But in the martial arts, people think they are. They think that by earning a black belt automatically qualifies them to open a dojo and teach martial arts. I'm not saying they can't. The question is, how long will that place stay open? Because running a business is a whole completely different skill set than teaching, and that's a completely different skill set from learning the stuff. Okay? So any given program answers, or any given approach to training answers the question it was designed to answer. At any given level, any technique can help us solve certain problems. Okay? But once it's solved it, figuratively speaking, it's waiting for you to ask a better question so that you can get different answers that'll take you to different levels. Okay? That's why I don't believe students plateau because they run out of things to learn. Right? I think they plateau because they continue asking the same questions. Yesterday's questions, right? Last month's questions, 5 years ago, whatever, right? The beginner asks, and rightly so, what do I do? We've been talking about this for how many episodes? Okay? The intermediate student asks, what if? What else could I do? The advanced student asks, what is this technique showing me about myself? Ooh. See, because in the beginning, a kata could be, and I think should be, seen as an expert role model. You want to be an expert? Here's how an expert would do it. Start here. But at a different level, a kata, just like those little kamae to kamae string patterns that I gave students last week, right, become bad habit breakers. Because if somebody can't do the kata, that's a big thing in our art, right? People keep defaulting to henka, right? But they're not doing henka. They're doing something else. They think, well, because things changed, I did this thing over here, and that's a henka. No, it isn't. A henka is a variation to the thing you're doing to account for a variable. Most people who are calling things henka do those things because they can't do the technique. Nothing wrong with the technique. It survived millennia. Okay? So, but again, every level requires a different conversation, requires a different perspective. It requires different questions. If you stay with the old conversation, you stay, you guessed it, at the old level. Okay? And we've talked about this in the past. People that stay at those levels, and it's not that they're not getting better. They're getting more smooth. They're getting faster. They're being able to do something with less mistakes and all that kind of stuff. But the technique still looks the same. Wait, I thought you said that the kata didn't change. The kata haven't evolved. Right. I also said we do. Okay. The other day I was showing students how to do musodori with flow, still sticking to the model, but where their uke, they could resist all they wanted, and it wouldn't matter. They can be bigger, stronger, wouldn't matter. Okay, but there was a certain point where we, and we did it off of what did we do it off of? A grab and a I don't know if we did a punch follow up or not, right? But there was a shift and then a shift to the other side. So instead of doing step 1, step 2, right, I did this thing, and at a certain point, no, there was a technique we did where it was punch, uke in the gash, shift and carry the arm, strike, and then strike the head, right? And so I did the same thing, 1, 2, and from this one position, I said, "Well, come on, man," kind of twisting their heads around and whatnot, and I said, "It's doko. If you still need to see doko this way to recognize doko, and not the lead hand covering what's important and the rear hand doing work or catching their attention from wherever that's necessary, then you don't yet understand doko. You recognize a snapshot, a form with a name. It's not the same." Okay. So again, back to the storyline, right? Okay. So the program didn't stop working, right? It simply accomplished what it was designed to accomplish, right? So martial arts training is exactly the same as the fitness analogy. Once the beginner questions have been answered, the curriculum isn't asking you to collect more techniques. It's asking you to begin asking different questions about the ones you already have. A lot of you probably get sick of seeing a quote that I shared from Matsumi Sensei. Everybody likes to share quotes around the internet and all that. Yeah, I put them in emails and whatever to back up the lesson, because some people need to see, some people need to play the Sensei Says game, whatever. Okay. So, but the quote actually came from a moment in class where he was frustrated. He said, students are in a hurry to get the next lesson, to get the next technique, but they haven't gone deeply enough into the ones they already have. Okay? But either way, right? This recognition that the questions and the perspective has to change, right? That's an important milestone, because many students think learning more means collecting more techniques, right? We talked about that. Sometimes it is, because there's things we're missing. There's techniques we're missing. There's angles, there's perspectives that we're missing. So sometimes we need a technique to do that. But sometimes learning more simply means asking better questions about the technique or techniques you already have. Okay? So what happens from here? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. James, any questions or comments? Piss off anybody? Anybody light the internet on fire? No.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be interesting?
No, just Misty checked in. That's it.
Awesome. Hey, dude. Missed you in class tonight. You probably had to work for the man. Not this one, but anyway. All right. So let's just keep on keeping on then. All right. So what happens here? Well, then something interesting happens. I think, eventually, if you stay with the art long enough, another shift occurs. And this one catches a lot of people by surprise, right? I've already mentioned this. I've already alluded to it, right? What happens is you stop evaluating the technique, and the technique begins evaluating you. And I know, I know how backwards that sounds. But remember what I said. In the beginning, the technique, the kata, is an expert role model. That's how most people associate with them, right? That I want to be an expert. Here's how an expert of Kukishindaoryu, Gyokoryu, Gyokushinryu, whatever, would do it. Okay, fair enough, right? And that serves a purpose to a point. But that kata is also a bad habit breaker. It's a lot of other things too, but for the moment, right? So now, if you've been watching KUDEN for a while, if you've been following along, Apple Podcast, whatever, right? Some of this may sound familiar, right? Several months ago, I started asking what seemed like a very simple, sometimes annoying question, because I kept asking it a lot, right? And that question was, why does any skill or technique deserve a place in a warrior protector's curriculum, in a modern warrior protector's curriculum? Any technique, any skill, onikudaki, mushadori, ichimonji no kata, whatever, okay? And we spent some time exploring that, right? Because that question was really from a perspective of understanding, not a perspective of should we throw a bunch of shit away and not do it like a lot of people do, right? And again, at first, that probably sounded like I was questioning the techniques themselves, right? Partly I was, but mostly I wasn't. What was being questioned was our relationship to those techniques. Because if people are looking at these techniques from the perspective of nobody fights like this on the street, nobody does it like this anymore, nobody wears armor or whatever, I can see why they'd scrap the whole goddamn thing and jump ship, go to Krav Maga, go to MMA, go make up their own shit, whatever. But because the value of a technique isn't fixed, remember Hatsumi Sensei's quote or lesson? Nothing is fixed. Okay? It changes, its purpose, the lessons, all that changes as we change. Right? The complexity, right? What's really funny is that at the level where I'm working now, and I'm actually trying to introduce some of my students to this, they've got some levels to go through to get here, but this is a level of simplification that allows for better operation as situational complexity increases. So a lot of martial arts, it's complexity of technique equals mastery, right? Like the beginner learns this easy thing, then next level learns more complicated, then more complicated, and pretty soon you're testing for 6 dan, and you only have to do one kata that has 46 fucking moves in it. Okay, I'm not knocking it. That's just you can tell by my inflection. That's not me. Okay, but that's technique complexity. That shit immediately fails as soon as you hit first contact with the enemy. It will not withstand pressure because too many things fucking change. But if I boil things down to principles and I can see them in everything that we do, and I get good at those, and I understand my kamae and their true nature, and I understand what kamae really is and not just these shapes that are expedients, and I understand what different strikes do, and not just like for that, but the fist itself, because a shuto is not a strike. It's a strike to a beginner. It's a fist. Kiten-ken, it's a fist. Fudo-ken, shikan-ken, they're fists. They're ways to form the fist that the beginner sees as ways to hit people with. Yeah, but what if that can be used for climbing? What if it can be used for anchoring onto somebody and launching myself into him with all that resistance and strength that he has going for him? And this is stronger than doing this. Okay, I'm sorry for those of you on audio only, right? I made a shito as a preference, right? This knife hand as a preference. It's much stronger. Uses a very different muscular system to be strong than using the fingertips or the way the human being normally grasps, right? It allows me to cover more space. And if that's not enough, then I can just hook from the wrist. And that uses bigger, broader muscles, right? But again, perspective has to change. The art doesn't change. What we see and where we are lesson-wise and level-wise. Everything is right in the level where you are and what you're learning and what you're working on. It's right and it's necessary, because without it, you can't build on the next level. But at a certain level, it's not complexity. It's not how many techniques I know. Okay? It's how many different situations or problems can that technique be adapted to. So situational complexity, and in the chaos of an actual situation, not that I would know anything about that, and those of you who know my background know that I do. Situational complexity will always be there. Okay. The question is can I do what ninjutsu is best known for? One of the things it's best known for, and that's adaptation. Okay. Not just can I do a mushadori, but from how many angles can I do a mushadori, right? Can I do a mushadori and catch his other hand in an uragyaku, right? So that he can't get out of either one. He tries to escape one, tightens the other. Can I do mushadori in a multiple attacker scenario, right? Can I do it, let's say I would normally do it to this arm over here. Can I reach across and do it with this arm? How many different ways can I do a mushadori that immobilizes that shoulder? Can I do it as a shoulder dislocation? Can I do it as a control that lays him down? Can I do it in a way that locks him up so either way, he can't get at me with the other fist, right? Do I absolutely understand mushadori, or do I just understand the basic delivery method or application method? Okay. I need to know that so I can get to these other levels. Okay. None of this is condemnation or anything to any level. All these things are necessary. The problem is when people either want to jump over them or they don't practice enough, or they think that learning the 0 point, learn the technique, right? That's the skill. That's the lesson. Once I learn that, get my new belt, I'm golden. Yeah, you can be golden, all right. Okay. Delivering some golden showers when all that shit fails against somebody who doesn't give a shit what you know. Anyway, all right, I digress. All right, so again, everything changes as a student changes, right? And again, something I think many people miss. Okay, a beginner does not look at a multi-gyaku the same way an advanced student does, nor should they. Okay, again, the beginner naturally asks, what do I do? How do I do this? What are the step-by-step things, right? They're looking for certainty. Yes? Yes. Right? The answer is yes, right? They're looking for things to be predictable, certain. If I do this, that happens, right? They don't want to hear shit about, well, he might, if he resists, if he's too big, or no, I need to know this works. Okay? All right, cool. Cool, I'll keep training, right? They're looking for a dependable answer to a problem they don't yet know how to solve. It's the only reason why people come to your classes, right? After they practice for a while, those questions do and should begin changing, right? Now they're asking, what else could I do? What if he resists? What if he's bigger? What if he's stronger? Or what if he doesn't let me grab his hand? Or like it's fucking July or August or December, the middle of my winter, but it's December in Australia and New Zealand, and you guys are sweating your balls off, right? And I go to take the hand, it slips off, okay? Right? So again, the beginner might start asking what ifs too at their level, but until they can do the basic technique, those what ifs, in all honesty, don't matter. I'm not saying they don't matter ever. I'm saying until the person can do the base technique, what ifs don't matter. They're irrelevant. Right? Again, the intermediate student may also ask, how do I link this or connect this to something else that I know, right? Whatever, right? The technique becomes one option among many at this stage, okay? And then somewhere along the journey, again, something awesome begins to happen. And then, again, questions change, right? If not directly by the student, they change because a good teacher starts asking them. They know what questions should be asked for the student to get to the next level, okay? Because often students don't know what to ask, okay? Or they're fixated on, ooh, look, I learned this, okay? So questions change again, right? Instead of asking what the technique can do, we start asking, right, what is this technique telling me about me, okay? And suddenly, this kata, right, that I've learned, I can recognize, I know it, right? This kata becomes diagnostic. It's no longer simply showing you how to move, right? At this level, it's exposing habits. It's revealing tension you didn't know you were holding on to. It's showing you where, I don't know, your timing breaks down, where you're relying on strength, where you're assuming instead of adapting. Okay? You see what's happening? Right? The technique never became more important. Your questions end up becoming more, we'll call it sophisticated. They become more precise. They become more almost like a detective asking questions. Okay? And every time the questions change, the same kata becomes almost like new again, right? And we're going to spend a lot more time on that idea, right, in a future episode. I think it's 319, so maybe two from now, right? Because I believe understanding how your questions evolve is one of the keys to understanding why a traditional curriculum is structured the way it is. Okay, understanding this process will help my personal students understand why our curriculum is laid out the way it is and why it's probably different than 90% of everybody else's, given that anybody has a curriculum. Okay, so anyway, getting back to what we were talking about, right? So you see what's happening, right? The technique didn't become more or less important, right? The questions you start asking were better. They're more specific. And every time they changed, again, it's almost like the same technique became like new again. Like, shit, do that again, right? Next thing you know, we're back doing Ichimonji no Kata again, or Sanshin Kano Waza or whatever, and whole new, right? Like I remember, it was right there in front of me the whole time, right? But when a teacher said, "Do you get it? Do you see it?" Right? Sanshin Kano Kata, Kano Waza, It's the same as Hicho no kata with a kick added. Hicho no kata is kan no kata with a kick added. You see it? And then when I had this breakthrough and I'm like, the Sanden Kamai, the Gyokoryu, Ichimonji, Hicho, Jimonji, Sanden Kata. Okay, you learn the Kamai, then you learn the Kata. Okay, cool. I always knew that, right? But then Sanden Kamai, they're all the same Kamai. No, wait. Ichimonji looks like this, and Hicho looks like this, and Jumonji looks like that. No. The Gyokoryu treats them as one Kamai, 3 different aspects for 3 different points or 3 different perspectives in an engagement timeline. Well, if they're the same, but different aspects of the same timeline, then Ichimonji no kata, Hichi no kata, and Jumonji no kata. All right, now how do they fit together? And I taught it for a while, right? Some of you guys remember that. Ichimonji no kata is the ideal, right? Here it comes. Move that out of the way. Whack his ass. It's over, right? Hichi no kata. Here it comes. I dealt with that, but it was a surprise, right? Instead of punching high, punch low. Shit, right? My leg comes up and I throw a kick to stop that next thing, right? Because I'm too far away to stop it with this or to break his balance with the uke nagash. Shit, I got to stop with something else. So I stop with the kick, and then I take advantage of that opening. So got the ideal. Now we got an oops, and I save it and finish. Okay, Jumonji no kata. What's that? Well, I always saw it as a hit and run kind of thing. See what he's going to do next. I don't know. If I knock that out of the way and poke somebody in the fucking ribs and make him hurt, you poke a bear who's already angry, maybe I don't want to know what he's going to do next. But maybe it's not that. If I have an ideal and I have an oopsie but fix it and can finish, shit. What if Jumonji no kata is I get to uke nagash and then I hit him and that didn't work. And now, oh shit, I need to clear. See? Questions, perspective, connections. Again, it's almost like looking at the same techniques like they were new all over again. Okay? But let's look at these things from this diagnostic, right? The kata becomes diagnostic. Okay? Suddenly, Omote Gyaku, right? As our example, right? Starts showing us things about our own taijutsu. Because we know it so well, right? Can I stick to the model? Can I do the model as described? No henka, no variation, whatever. Okay, it's almost inside out, right? So it starts showing us things. Like maybe your shoulders are lifting when they shouldn't. Or you're pulling with your arms instead of with your body. Right? My students, they all chuckle because I say it all the time. Look, I'm not pulling, but a pull occurs. Stop pulling. What I mean is with your arms. If you're falling back with your body weight, that will pull him. Okay? But it might show me that I'm stepping too late, I'm stepping too early, or I'm off the line that I should be on for this guy to just collapse. That I don't have to, right? Maybe we learned early on at a certain stage that the hand is a steering wheel. So, that kind of thing, right? But what if I don't have to touch his hand? What if I can't get a hold of his hand? What if all I can get is like a tentative grip on his wrist? Can I still take him off his heels and make him fall the same way in the same place? Yes, I can. Okay. But I need to make sure that line is right. My timing has to be right. I have to understand how to dissolve structure. I need to undermine the things that allows for him to be strong, stable, fast, resistant, whatever, right? But again, the kata, when I'm focusing on this as a diagnostic, right, it starts showing me my own mistakes, right? My balance slips during the turn, or I over rotate, right? Who knows, right? You're trying to force the lock instead of creating the conditions where the lock naturally just fucking happens by default, right? Or and this is a big transition for beginners to upper levels, where they're focused too much on pain and pain compliance, which is highly unreliable, right? They're focused on that and not control. Yes? Okay. The technique hasn't become harder. Trust me, at this stage, you will experience more difficulty. It'll be like feeling like you're a beginner again. Been doing this my entire freaking career, been doing this for 2-3 years, whatever. Why is it so fucking hard? It's because what you're looking at and what you're trying to accomplish, it's exposing mistakes. Or you pick up speed, or he's allowed to resist. Yeah, it's true. Okay. So the kata doesn't become a learning device for self-defense. It becomes a mirror to how effectively and efficiently I can use my own body, how much control I actually have over my own body. I remember one teacher saying one time, how can you possibly imagine, how can you possibly believe that you can control somebody else's body when you can't even control your own? I can control my own body. And then I went through the diagnostic phase using kata. Yeah, okay. Right? So it's one of the reasons I often tell students not to be frustrated when something stops working. Right? In fact, when we increase speed, when we increase pressure, when we increase complexity, when we allow your uke to resist, we should hope that the technique stops working. That way we can identify where the problem area is and we can fix it. Right? After all, the dojo is where you want to discover your mistakes, not when a real world assailant is trying to beat, break, or kill you, right? Or someone that you're trying to protect. Okay? Well, ferret out the fucking mistakes in the dojo, in class. Don't be afraid of them. Okay? So the point here is that sometimes the kata isn't failing. It's simply exposing a habit that, no offense, you've been able to hide until now, right? I had to face the same things, right? But honestly, that's one of the greatest gifts that good training can give us. Now, ego doesn't like it for sure, right? Ego always wants to be right. Well, it always thinks it is right, but either way, right? But we need to understand that this is an important stage of unforgiveness, right? Because your attacker is not going to forgive your mistakes like your uke does. He's not going to ignore your mistakes. He's not going to play along. Your fucking attacker is going to exploit the hell out of them, right? And he's going to use them to beat your ass. Okay? So, one of the lessons I picked up in Japan, right? One of the things I noticed over the years training with Hans Sensei was, like I said, he demonstrated what looked like a very familiar kata, right? Everybody watching it would think, "Nah, okay, cool, I know that one," right? And within just a few seconds, everyone was lost. Okay? Now it's being done by the other master teachers. I remember this last time. Some of you guys already probably know the story. Alan and Trinity and Kyle were actually there when it happened. But this happened in Nagato Sensei's class, right? It's doing a fairly basic model. And it involved in putting a onikodaki on somebody. You know, one of the Kyonapo. Yeah, one of those things. And stopped freaking class. And his uke punch, he puts his forearm on the uke's forearm, right? Certain part of the arm to a certain part of his arm, right? Didn't even get to the omote gyaku. He's like, this is a basic, right? right? This piece is a basic, right? That gotcha 10, right? This divot to a divot, right? This is a basic, right? And people are nodding and smiling. This is Onikudaki is dependent on that connection, that control. But what's the beginner see? The beginner sees, I know I did, right? The outside of this forearm goes on the inside of that forearm, and the outside of this forearm goes on the outside, or forearm goes on the outside of that upper arm, and then my hands go together, and then anyway. So again, people end up getting lost, right? And it wasn't because he abandoned the kata. Okay? It was because he ended up shining a light on a layer most of us never noticed before. Right? The shape or the form of what he was showing looked familiar, but the lesson wasn't. Okay? How he got from point A to point B wasn't. Right? Or how he was affecting his uke looked almost invisible, right? Until he pointed it out. Okay? I remember coming home from Japan more than once, absolutely jazzed about teaching what I had just learned, right? I often do a Japan recap seminar, unload some of this stuff. People couldn't make it, but wanted to learn. Here we go, right? So I come back, I'm really jazzed about learning this stuff. And, only to realize that what I thought I'd learned was mostly just the surface level. Just, I see the demonstration, I'm mimicking the demonstration, but it was going to take a whole lot more work to ferret out what he was actually doing with those moves. Not just where he was touching, not just which leg stepped, not which would just with fist hit what. Okay. So anyway, was Sensei changing the art? No. Sometimes it looked like it at whatever level I was at, but no. What Sensei was doing was changing me. Or perhaps more accurately, he was giving me another opportunity, right, to change myself, to see one or more things that I missed before. Okay? It's kind of like that old Zen expression, right? Many of you have probably already heard this thing, right? That don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. Okay? The finger matters, right? Without it, you might never know where to look. But if all you study is the finger, you'll miss what it's pointing toward. Okay? So what's that got to do with training? I think kata, any of the techniques are very much like that. They're a road sign or they're a finger, right? They're pointing. They're directing our attention. They're saying, look at this, look over here, look at what this does, look at, okay? But if all we're ever concerned with is copying or aping or mimicking the official form, the external shape, we may never discover what it was designed to show us all along. It's kind of like my dog sitting there on the bed. Unless something on the TV, unless there's another dog that barks and she decides to go ape shit because she heard a dog barking, and we have to go, it's on the TV, right? But I can point at the TV, right? Dog's not barking anymore. And I go, it's on the TV. My dog will look at my finger, sniff my finger, look back at me, lay back down again. Okay? We have to be careful that, like, there's a stage where the forms matter. There's a stage where the forms connect. There's a stage where the forms are useful to uncover bad habits. But through all that, we need to be extracting a level of understanding that allows us to cross over into a level where it's formless. Everybody likes to quote Hatsumi Sensei's thing, right? Throw away the kata, throw away the techniques, you don't need them. He was talking to people at a very specific level, not everyone. And that's the problem with these goddamn quotes being shared around the internet, like they're for everybody at all times. Right? It's just not true. Right? So anyway, let's see. We can talk about layers some more and all that, but I think I don't want to beat a dead horse, right? So again, what gets in the way, right? Why do people plateau? And again, I believe the answer isn't a lack of ability, right? I believe it's something more subtle, right? And it's that thing that we've all experienced, right? And I'm just gonna call it back out again: familiarity, right? And more specifically, what familiarity unknowingly but eventually becomes, right? When we stop questioning it, it's the assumptions. Okay. So anyway, let me skip through my notes here because I don't want to keep dragging this out. All right. So I don't know how that ended up in there. Sorry about that. All right. Anyway, James, while I'm leafing through things here, questions, comments, anything?
No, nothing's coming.
So I've either put them to sleep or they're pretending that they're on. Is that what we're talking about?
That's what it looks like.
Maybe. Sure looks like it. All right. Anyway, all right. So how do we combat this? Right? I've been hinting at it, jumping around a little bit, but what do we do? How do we get ahead of the curve, so to speak? Right? So well, let me ask this, right? We talked about assumptions, right? Assumptions are powerful, right? We can use them. They get us to a certain place, whatever, okay? How do we keep them from taking over our training? How do we continue seeing familiar techniques with fresh eyes? Okay? How do we do that? I think the answer begins with understanding the difference between looking at a movement and studying or investigating what the movement is trying to teach you. Everybody knows uke nagash. I almost said understands. Everybody knows uke nagash. There's many different types of uke nagash. But what does uke nagash teach? What skills does it improve? See, everybody sees it as a skill. Everybody knows kamae. But what does kamae collectively, regardless of form, what does it teach? What does it teach at the beginner level? What does it teach at the advanced level? What is body movement collectively? Walking, rolling, break falls, leaping. What does that teach? So everybody wants to stop it learning to leap, learning to roll, learning. What does rolling teach? What does body movement in general teach? What does striking teach? What if I say that in Budo Taijutsu or Nippo Taijutsu, we don't have grappling? Oh, before the comment things get flooded with the bullshit, what do you call throws and onikudaki and omotegyaku? You've been talking about omotegyaku. What do you mean we don't have grappling? Well, that would require understanding what grappling, force on force, chikara kurabe, is all about. And since ninjutsu is not that it's asymmetrical warfare, what if what we call grappling is nothing more than a combination of kamae, body movement, and striking? Wait, you said grappling. Now you're saying striking. Okay, what does striking teach? Yes, it teaches impact with the body, but I can do that with a forearm. It doesn't have to be a fist. It doesn't have to literally be a fist. Do it with a forearm, do it with an elbow, I can do it with my head, I can do it with my chin, whatever, right? But striking, as most people think of it, is limb extension and retraction. Well, shit, so is grabbing. So is catching fronto nukadaki. What if I didn't? What if I couldn't because of injury, burns, whatever? Grab a hand to do a motegyaku and had to just pin it and use my body to make it happen. Whatever, okay? But what if we explored all of our quote-unquote grappling techniques from the perspective that we don't have grappling as most people think of it, that all we use is kamae, which is just body position, right? Relative to him. Body movement, walking, leaping, shifting, whatever, taisabaki, right? And limb extension and retraction. What if we had to do all of these things, no hands? Or we couldn't grab an omotegyaku like we're normally used to seeing it, and we're only allowed to touch his wrist, lower forearm. Well, that might change things a little bit, okay? So, but either way, right? Getting fixated on a movement and investigating what that movement is trying to teach you, there's two very different kinds of training, okay? And I think that's exactly what some teachers, Hatsumi Sensei, Shrai Sensei, Rob Renner, I was just at one of his seminars. I think that what they've been trying to help people discover all along, okay? Changing the questions. So again, if familiarity naturally becomes assumption, and assumptions eventually slow our growth, what do we do about it? Train harder, practice more reps, memorize more techniques. Sometimes those things are useful, but I don't think they're the real answer. I think the answer is much simpler and much more difficult. The answer is to ask better questions, to recognize that any level that we're at is not the finish line. There is no finish line. There's always another level. Okay? If we keep that in mind, we might remember to ask, not that we shouldn't be proud of like the accomplishments we made, the abilities we have, the capability we have, and all that, but if we remember to keep ego in check and remember that there's always another level, because I don't know what I'm going to need against the jackass that decides to jump me, or jackasses, or the weapons, or whatever. Okay? If I remember that kata are like the delivery van that brings the new furniture that you just bought to your house, but it parks in a driveway, right? You don't drive it through the fucking front door and park it in your living room and then use your furniture from the back of the truck. Kata are just like that truck. They'll get you so far. They're useful in many different ways. But eventually, you need a whole different process. Just like my fitness example, all that, right? So remember what we've been talking about during this episode, right? The beginner asks, what do I do? The intermediate student asks, what? What else could I do, right? a bunch of what ifs. The advanced student asks, what is this showing me about my movement? Where might I be compromised, but I don't know it? Because believe it or not, making mistakes in exactly performing a technique, those little body control errors, whether he does it on purpose or he does it by accident, I don't need those things popping out. Because if I need to move in a certain direction at a certain time and I lack the ability to do so, well, then I'm an accomplice to my own ass kicking. Okay? So the thing here is hopefully you're noticing something, right? Again, the technique didn't change. We changed. The student changed. Okay? More accurately, the student's questions changed. And every time the questions changed, the technique became almost like new again. Okay? I mentioned Rob Brenner earlier. Like I said, I was sat in virtually on part of his Florida seminar, and then Kyle and I went down to the Maryland seminar. And one of the things I appreciate a lot while training with Rob was watching him deliberately remove the familiar path. What I mean by that is many instructors teach you a kata. You go to a seminar and you're expected, you're learning new techniques and all that. But what Rob focused on almost entirely was the effect. And then he sometimes sneakily, sometimes obviously, whatever, just start taking other pieces away. Okay. So what happens if your hand isn't there, right? What if you don't get the grip? What if he moves sooner? What if there's more than one of them, right? What if one guy's here and the other guy's over here, right? What if what if he moves sooner, right? What if you never complete the lock? How can you still take him down, right? All those things, right? At first, you can see it, right? Students often become uncomfortable because the familiar roadmap, the kata, the form that we all know is gone. It disappeared, right? They wanted those steps back. You could see people like drifting into, but like I would normally, and I even heard people, like I was working with training partners and stuff, I would normally do it like this, and then I would do it like this, and that always works for me, but he wants me to do it like this. Right? Okay, but yeah. So even if they didn't ask him for the steps back, they were still trying to go through them in their head, right? But Rob wasn't trying to confuse anyone, right? He was trying to separate the movement from the purpose of the movement. That's a huge distinction, okay? Because eventually the question changes from how do I perform omotagyaku to how do I create the same effect many different ways? Those are completely different conversations. Okay? One's about choreography. The other one's about understanding. Right? And when you begin asking about effects instead of hard, fast, official, stylized movements, suddenly dozens of techniques start pointing toward the exact same principles. Okay. So one more story before we wrap this up. A bunch of years ago, I had Shidoshi Malmstrom in for a seminar. And first day, like, introduce him, he comes out, and he tells a joke or two because that was him, right? And then he said something that caught everybody off guard, right? He looked around the room and he said, everything I'm going to teach you today is shit. Right? So again, as you can imagine, that certainly got everybody's attention. Now, before anybody misunderstands what he meant, right? He wasn't criticizing the techniques. He wasn't criticizing the tradition. He wasn't telling everybody that you were in a bait and switch I'm going to teach you a bunch of crap stuff that's worthless. But thanks for showing up and paying your tuition. No, he wasn't saying any of that, right? He wasn't saying the training was worthless, right? He was saying something that was just way more important, much more important. What he was saying was, like, these things work for me. They work for Jeff. They work for these other seniors. Okay? I can make them, I can do them, right? Until you do the work, everything you hear and see during this or any training is only information. Information isn't transformation. Watching, I don't care if it's live in a dojo or it's on a video, isn't transformation. Listening and hearing the lessons isn't transformation. Even agreeing with your teacher isn't transformation. Transformation begins when information changes the way you perceive, the way you think, and the way you act. Okay? I've often thought about how that statement, right, that he used, right, could be misunderstood. And I don't know, personally, if I was a different person, I might phrase it a little bit differently, right? I could see where people might feel more comfortable if I'd say, everything I'm showing you today is potential. But you know what? Sometimes nice doesn't work. Sometimes soft training doesn't work. Sometimes stroking people's ego doesn't work. Okay? Because that just allows people and their egos to sweep things under the carpet. And eventually there's so much shit swept under the carpet that it's a surprise that nobody breaks their fucking neck walking from the front door to the couch. Okay? So the point is that whether it becomes skill, ability, street level capability, it's not in the fact that the lesson was taught or that you were in class for it or whatever. It depends entirely on what you do with it after you leave the teacher's class. Most people don't think about training until they're actually packed up and ready to head to class. They might have little moments here or there. Class time is not practice time. Class time is learning time. Homework, practice shit we do outside of class. Excuse me. That's what'll get you to mastery faster. Okay? So again, this helped me understand something about Hatsumi Sensei. People sometimes ask, why does Sensei teach the same thing every year? Well, at least he looks like he's doing the same thing. That's why a lot of good practitioners stop going to Japan. They figure they already have it. They already know that stuff. Okay? Keeps doing the same stuff. I think they're asking the wrong question. Better question is, why should he? Right? If his purpose were simply to help us memorize movement, then yes. Repeat the exact same seminar, the same techniques, the same skills, the same thing every year, all the time. But if his purpose is to continue developing our perception, our ability to see, then eventually he must disrupt our familiarity, what we think we know. Otherwise, he'd become part of the very same problem that he's trying to solve. Okay? So one of the things that I've realized over the years is that great teachers rarely give final answers. And this is a big thing about Japanese education. Okay? The teacher only gives so much because the student is supposed to discover the answer. And psychology backs this up, right? The more we're given, the less we retain, the less value we see in it, because it just solves the ego problem I mentioned way back earlier. Okay? But when we discover something for ourselves, when we come up with the plan, those kind of things, man, we hold on to that way more, right? That's a hard won lesson, and it just holds more value, right? So, I mean, anyway, there's lots more we could cover. I don't want to. I'm getting tired, and we're just gonna kind of round this thing out, right? So, James, anything else pop up?
No, still nothing.
Okay, so where does all this leave us, right? If familiarity isn't the enemy, if assumptions can slow our progress, and if better questions keep the art alive for us, right? Then again, perhaps the goal isn't simply learning more. Perhaps the goal is never allowing ourselves to believe we've reached the end of the investigation or the training or whatever. Okay, because I think that's exactly what separates the technician, the beginner, the mechanic oriented kind of person, right, from the tatsujin, from the master. Okay, so let's finish there, right? The tatsujin, fully actualized human being, the master, whatever, right? Okay, they never stop studying, they never stop exploring, they never stop investigating. Okay, they know that there's no arrival. Nagato Sensei, this last time, he's a soke of Shinden Fudo-ryu, right? He's a senior master teacher. He said he was revisiting the Kyorapo again. Most people are like, yeah, I'm beyond that. I'm not doing that. And here's, like, if a soke is still revisiting it, how the flock does anybody think that they're better than that? Okay, so let's come back to where we started, right? A simple phrase. I know that, right? After everything that we've talked about this evening, I hope those 3 words feel just a little bit different now. Right? Not because they're wrong, right? But because they deserve another question. At what level do I know it? Do I recognize it? Can I reproduce it? Do I understand why it works? Can I recognize when it doesn't? Can I create the same effect under completely different conditions? Can I teach someone else in a way that helps them discover it? Those are very different levels of knowing. And I don't think any of us ever truly reach the end of that journey. Right? One of the greatest gifts a teacher can give a student isn't another answer. To the frustration of many of my students, it's not another answer. It's another question. Think about that. The teacher who answers every question may create very knowledgeable students. But the teacher who teaches students how to investigate, how to ferret out things from different perspectives, that teacher creates independent students, ones who can do it for themselves. Okay? And that's always been my goal, right? Over the years, I have said many times that, and my students don't like it when I say it, right? But I'm not going to be around forever. Okay? But I've said many times that I don't want students becoming dependent on me. It's not a responsibility thing, right? It's because that's not success. Not for a teacher. Success is when you become increasingly dependent on your own ability to observe, to question, to experiment, to test, to fail, to refine, and to continue discovering new things. Right? everyone should understand, especially in the martial arts. Everyone, students and teachers alike, that when a student comes to a teacher, that person is virtually placing their lives in the hands of that teacher. Trust, faith, whatever you want to call it, right? That their teacher is going to give them what they need. And their lives remain in that teacher's hands until they either walk away or until the point they reach where they can do it for themselves. It's a heavy responsibility. Okay? Because eventually, whether it's me or whoever your teacher is now or whatever, right? I'm not going to be standing next to you. Right? Your instructor isn't standing next to you. Your training partner isn't standing next to you. When the shit goes down, the only thing you'll have is your ability to perceive what's happening and adapt appropriately to that thing in that moment, that context. And that's what we're really training. Okay? So, one of the things I've always admired about Hatsusumi Sensei is that he never seemed to behave like someone who believed he'd finished learning. Okay? I remember one time he unraveled these, like there were 5 or 6 spear heads that he was going to get mounted. Here he had bought the scrolls to another lineage, found in some used bookstore or whatever, and he was studying these things. And it was a lot of stuff was about spear. He was really trying to kind of work this stuff out and everything. And he said, I came to a point where I couldn't go any farther without the spears, without understanding them. The dimensions were there, the wood that the spears are made out of or whatever. And then he ended up searching for these spearheads from this lineage and found these 5 or 6. Spent the equivalent of $30,000 US. So he could have these things mounted so he could continue studying. Okay? Here was a man recognized around the world as a master, and yet he continued experimenting, playing, exploring, changing, investigating. Right? That wasn't inconsistency. That was curiosity. And I think curiosity is one of the defining characteristics of the Tatsujin. Not because the Tatsujin knows less, but because the Tatsujin understands there's always another layer. There's always another perspective. There's always another relationship. There's always another question. Nothing is fixed. Right? The day we stop investigating isn't the day we stop learning. It's the day we stop noticing there was still something else to learn. Right? So I want to leave you with a challenge for the week. Right? Next time you catch yourself saying, I know, or I know that, or whatever, don't stop there. I mean, you may stop in the right, but take a moment after it's over, later in the day, take a little note to yourself, whatever, right? And ask yourself, how do I know it? What do I believe that's true? What assumptions am I making about that thing that I, quote unquote, know? Right? When was the last time I genuinely looked at that? When did I genuinely investigate this thing? Right? Again, when did I revisit it? Right? Maybe it's a kata. Maybe it's ichimonji. Maybe it's omotagyaku. Maybe it's happo. Right? Maybe it's how you communicate with your spouse, partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. Right? Maybe it's how you lead your team at work. Right? Maybe it's how you raise your children. Maybe it's how you solve problems at work or wherever. Right? Right? Because this conversation has never really been about martial arts. Martial arts simply gives us a laboratory. The real subject has always been how human beings learn. And unless you're a cyborg and I didn't know it, or you're an alien and I didn't know it, okay? This is still about the human condition. Okay? And this has been about how we learn, and it's been about how we subtly, unknowingly stop learning without ever realizing it. Okay? So, again, before we finish tonight, if this discussion has resonated with you, I'd like for you to I'd like to invite you to continue the investigation with us. Again, our fall intensive isn't designed to overwhelm you with more techniques. It's designed to help you see the techniques you've already learned through different eyes. So anyway, consider joining us in October for that. We have live options and virtual options. I don't know. You might learn something. Okay. But what I'm hoping is that people will discover what I'm trying to help them uncover is these universal principles hiding underneath all of these lessons, right? And to help them ask better questions and hopefully leave with a completely different relationship to your training. Okay. If you can't make that, or even if you can make that, right? Hopefully you'll join us for our New Year's thing, our Dakomyo Sai. Again, we're going to return to fundamentals, but it won't be the same way that everybody's been doing it. Okay. It's all still correct, all still right, all that stuff. Anyway, so yeah, and even after we sign off, if you have any thoughts, comments, whatever, keep them nice. As long as they're true, right? Just don't be an asshole about it. Leave a comment. Okay. How does this stuff benefit? How's it working for you? What are you getting out of it? Otherwise, James, any last minute questions or comments before we wrap this up?
No, I have not seen anything come in.
All right. These things just last too damn long. You know me. I got to cover the lesson. So anyway, no. The average length of podcast has significantly increased over the years. You notice that? Right? They're now 2 to 3 hours. That's what the statistics say anyway, right? So anyway. All right. So I think that's it. If there's nothing else, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Hopefully my local people I better see in class. Hopefully I'll see everybody on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for our weekly whiteboard training. And if not, then I'll see you next week on KUDEN.